This content is not suitable for children and may contain depictions of violence.
Hi, I'm your host Cambo. Grab a beer and pull up a deck chair. This is True Crime Island, another true crime podcast. Hi Islanders, a happy new year to you all. And we start off this new year with one of the biggest cases in Australia in the last 20 or so years. Now, 3 women will be abducted, 2 will be found murdered, and the third will assumed to have met the same fate. It all happened in a suburb of Perth, Western Australia, called Claremont. So the references tonight are from WA Today, The Age, abc.net.au, the Sydney Morning Herald, and Court Records. Okay, so we go back over 20 years to Claremont, Western Australia, which in the mid-90s had a population of about 7,500 people. It's a western suburb of Perth in Western Australia on the north bank of the Swan River, just 15 or so minutes drive from Perth CBD. Now, Claremont back in the day, and still is, a suburb where you'll find those on the wealthier side. There's plenty of private schools in the area, and usually with this type of demographic, the suburb is seen as a safe and secure place to live and grow up in. Now, the rich kids, they'd hang out at a couple of favourite places, the Club Bayview on St Quentin Avenue and Church Lane, and another favourite was the Continental Hotel on Bayview Terrace and Gugary Street, and that's just to name a couple of these venues. But on the night of Friday, January 26, 1996, the perceived safety and security of this upper-class suburb would be shattered. January 26 is Australia Day, a public holiday, and being a Friday, most of the young locals would be organising nights out in town with their friends. 18-year-old Sarah Spears, just like many others that night, had organised to meet friends, talk, have a few drinks. Now, Sarah was brought up in the country. Her father was a shearing contractor based in Darkin. She attended Iona Presentation College at Mossman Park, and as her family were from the country, she was a boarder at that school. Now, the college isn't that far from Claremont, so she was pretty familiar with the area. After graduating high school, she did secretarial studies and landed a receptionist job with an engineering firm called BSD Consultants in Subiaco. She was popular, full of life and laughter according to her friends, and she had been living with her sister Amanda in an apartment in South Perth. So on this Australia Day night in 1996, Amanda drove to the Ocean Beach Hotel on Cotslow Beach, picked up Sarah and her friends and dropped them off just after midnight at Club Bayview in Claremont. Now, Sarah hugged Amanda, thanking her for doing the taxi duty, and she went off with her friends. After a couple of hours, Sarah and her friends departed the club to go home. Now, Sarah called a taxi at 2:06 a.m. on the 27th of January, and she said that her destination was Mossman Park.
Hello, taxi service?
Pick up from where?
From Stirling Street in Cottesloe.
What number, or are you at the phone booth?
I'm at the phone booth.
What street is it? Challenge?
It's on Stirling Street. It's on the corner of Stirling Street and Stirling Highway, round about the middle up.
Stirling Street and Stirling Highway?
That's right.
What suburb?
In Claremont.
So the corner of Stirling Highway and Stirling Road in Claremont.
That's right.
Where are you going to?
Mossman Park.
And the name?
Spears.
Spears.
That's right.
Okay, thanks for calling.
A taxi was dispatched to pick her up, but by the time the taxi arrived, she was no longer at that location. A short time later, a series of screams were heard in the Mossman Park area, just south of Claremont. Now, 2 of the witnesses who heard the screams, they observed a light-coloured station wagon parked near a telephone box. Now, Sarah has never been seen since. It didn't take long for her friends and family to notice her missing. She was always in contact with her family, and of course she lived with her sister Amanda and even had arranged for her friends to stay over on the Sunday. Now, she was reported as missing to the local police, and within days the major crime squad was involved. Her mother would tell reporters that Sarah's a very caring person and she's just very attached to Amanda. Amanda's her best friend, not only her sister, and not to keep in contact with Amanda even more than us, I would say, is just so unusual. Her father said she wasn't ignorant to the dangers of the city. It was unusual for her not to be in company at that time because we stressed to them always to keep company, never to be alone. And that was probably the most unusual thing, that she did part company with her friends. Now, family and friends did whatever they could. They posted missing persons printouts around town, asking anyone if they saw her late that night. They were hopeful that she'd return, but as days went on, it didn't look good. Now, her bank accounts hadn't been touched, there were no records of her leaving the country, and she made no contact with friends or family. Now, Club Bayview, they put up a $10,000 reward for information about her disappearance. In fact, the state government ran a $130,000 television campaign to warn women against taking risks at night. For Don, Sarah's father, he would be contacted by clairvoyants, and he'd end up driving all over countryside following these clairvoyants' leads, and that's really sad. So Sarah going missing, well, it shocked the community, and as happens, rumours of what happened started to get around town. Still, life didn't really change for those young people who went out to the various nightclubs and bars in the area. But soon, things would change dramatically. On the Saturday, 8th of June 1996, 23-year-old Jane Rimmer went out with her friends. Now, Jane was a childcare worker who was extremely close to her family. Although moved out from home, she would go back every Saturday morning to wash her clothes and talk about what had been going on. Now, how many of us have done that? Just go home, dump all your washing, get all that done, and have a chat with mum and dad. Now, there was also a regular Sunday lunch with the family, and she would even drop in during the week to see her mum after work. Now, she grew up in Shenton Park and attended Hollywood High School. Jane did part-time work at a deli and was a keen surfer chick down at Cotslow Beach. When she left school, she had a childcare job in Nedlands and then went to work for a family as a nanny. Now, when this nanny job finished, the Nedlands Childcare Centre were happy to have her back. In a video of a friend's wedding, she's seen smiling, laughing and dancing to ABBA's Dancing Queen. She was bubbly and liked by all. As I said, on the Saturday, the 8th of June 1996, Jane went out with her friends in the Claremont area. They went to the Continental Hotel on Bayview Terrace and Gagary Street. Now, if you are going to Google this, the place has changed names over the years and is currently the Claremont Hotel. Anyway, towards the end of the evening at around 11:53 p.m, Jane was waiting with her friends to get a taxi home. Now, whilst waiting, Jane left the group to go for a walk and was absent when one of her friends managed to flag down a taxi. Now, her friends directed the taxi to drive down Bayview Terrace and to stop near where Jane was standing. Her friends asked whether she wanted to leave with them, however, she declined. The last sighting of Jane was soon after on security footage outside the Continental Hotel at 12:04 a.m. Now, Jane, as I said before, was extremely close to her family, and it wasn't long for them to contact police and report her as a missing person. Now, this spooked the community. The day after Jane went missing, the West Australian Police set up a special task force called Macro to investigate these two cases. They must have already known, even at this early stage, that someone very dangerous was lurking in the area. Rumours were going around that either a rogue or even a fake taxi driver was the culprit, or even someone posing as a police officer, because both Sarah and Jane were careful enough not to get a lift with someone they didn't know. So it looked like could be someone they would trust. Now, to help calm everyone down a bit, taxi drivers en masse, well, they were happy to have their fingerprints and DNA taken to prove they were safe to be hired, as their business had suffered a major downturn. The taxi industry actually underwent a bit of reform from all of this, with a stack of drivers with significant criminal history. They were delicensed. There was also a higher standard of examination required to become a taxi driver, and old decommissioned taxis were required to strip themselves of the signature, or the branding on the side, and any equipment like the lights on top, all that sort of stuff. Sadly, on Saturday the 3rd of August 1996, just 55 days after she went missing, Jane's naked body was found 40 kilometres or 25 miles south of Claremont in bushland near Walcott Road, Wellard. No real attempt had been made to bury her body, rather she'd been covered by branches broken off from nearby trees. Although not released at the time, her throat had been cut and she had defensive cut wounds on her arm. Witnesses would recall hearing screams in the area on the morning of Sunday, June the 9th, when Jane had been abducted. One clue they did find was a Telstra-issued knife which was found on a nearby road. Now, Telstra, they used to be called Telecom Australia. It's one of the main telcos in Australia, of course. With the news that Jane's body had been found and Sarah was still missing, women obviously didn't feel safe on the streets, especially if they found themselves walking alone. Police had quite a lot of leads to follow up, but still, they had no clear suspects. All they had was that both Jane and Sarah were young women, they'd socialised in the same area, and had ended up apart from their friends at the end of the night. Now, police suspected a serial killer, and they knew if they didn't get him off the streets, he could strike again. Then on Friday, the 14th of March 1997, 27-year-old Kira Glennon went out for a few drinks with her mates after work, her work colleagues. Kira was born in Zambia to Irish parents. In the mid-70s, the family moved to Perth and lived in the affluent riverside suburb of Mossman Park. Kira loved ballet dancing from a young age. Her father described her as resourceful, resilient and strong-willed. Kira graduated from the University of WA in 1992 with degrees in law and Japanese. She got an internship at law firm Blake Dawson Waldron, where she began work in early 1993. She then spent a year travelling the world before she came back to Perth to be a bridesmaid at her younger sister Denise's wedding in February 1997. On Friday, the 14th of March, after drinks with her workmates, Kira left the Continental Hotel on foot alone shortly before midnight with the intention of returning home. She was seen walking down Bayview Terrace and then along Stirling Highway. Now, some witnesses report seeing a woman fitting her description in close proximity to a white VS Holden Commodore station wagon at around 12:30 a.m. When her parents reported her missing, you can just imagine what they thought, and police probably thought as well, that Kira had become the latest victim of what would become known as the Claremont serial killer. Again, with no activity on her bank accounts and no records of her leaving the country, Task Force Macro would have been treating her disappearance as a homicide. On April the 3rd, just 19 days after going missing, Kira's body was found in bushland near Pippendini Road near Eglinton. Pippendini Road was a similar distance from Claremont that Jane Rimmer had been found. The difference being that Jane was found south of Claremont and Pipperdinny was north of Claremont. Kira was killed by a cutting wound to the neck, and that she also incurred a defensive wound to her forearm, and this was similar to the wounds suffered by Jane. Now, Kira's body had also not been buried and had been covered by broken off branches, just as Jane's body had been left. There was no doubt that the same person was the culprit. And looking at how the branches had been torn off, investigators concluded that the person was quite tall and strong. Now, police had acquired a lot of forensic evidence from the two recovered women, but this is 1997. Now, DNA is being used, but with small degraded samples, not much could be taken from the results. They did, however, have multiple reports of a white van or station wagon seen in the vicinity of where the women were abducted. Now, some described it as having maybe a Telstra logo on the side, as the telecom thing. Then on 3 a.m. on Sunday the 5th of April 1998, 41-year-old public servant Lance Williams was arrested at his Cotslow Beach apartment. They even searched his nearby parents' house. Lance was the eldest of 5 children and had never married and had only recently left home. Lance came to the police's attention because they observed him driving around Claremont Entertainment Zone very slowly at night. Media got hold of reports that he'd followed up to 30 women in the area. Now, when questioned by police, they went hard on him for about 10 hours, constantly telling him that he was lying and to confess. Now, Lance had actually been stopped by a woman walking home alone one night. Now, he did pull over and she asked him about when the next bus arrived. He told her that there were no more buses, and he ended up giving her a lift a short distance down the road to where she lived. He couldn't believe women were still walking the streets alone at night after what had been happening over the past year or so. Now, after months of interviews and surveillance, Lance actually suggested that he take a polygraph to hopefully get the cops off his back. Well, that didn't work out too well for Lance, as apparently he failed this polygraph. Now, a thing that police sort of overlooked, so to speak, about Lance was that he didn't even own a car when Sarah went missing. Then his identity was leaked to the media, and as he left work one day, he was pounced on by a media scrum. The first question was, "Are you the serial killer?" He politely denied he was, and it was really a disgusting display from the media. Now his face was splattered all over the news, and even his parents were being hassled by this media scrum. The next day after the commotion, Lance took a day off work, as you can imagine, after being put through this, splashed all over the TV, being ambushed by the media in such a high-profile murder case. Now, guess what the headlines were the next day? Claremont suspect skips work. I mean, what the fuck? Then, I was reading on the Age, the 30th of May, 1998, an article on another person who was rumoured to be this Claremont serial killer. It was Peter Weigers, former mayor of Claremont, psychologist and president of the Council for Civil Liberties. Now, he made no friends when he helped derail the political career of former West Australian Premier Carmen Lawrence, and the police didn't like his campaign on law and civil rights. He was sent in the post 4 questions in a survey. The questions were: do you know who abducted or murdered either girl? Did you abduct or murder either girl? Should we believe your answers to the questions? And if you were asked to pay for counselling for the parents of the girls, how much would you pay? I mean, what the fuck? The cops are sending this out. Now, being a civil libertarian, he refused to answer it, but he felt he was being set up. I mean, don't answer because you're guilty, that sort of thing. The fact he was selected of one of a few that were sent this craziness, this fact was also leaked to the media. Now, he stated that it was dangerous to law-abiding citizens because it set a precedent for police action that denied basic legal rights. Now, once it was out that he'd been sent this questionnaire, He found a dead cat's head in his mailbox. Police denied he was ever a suspect. Yeah, right. Why send him a questionnaire? By 1998, the media was still reporting on the missing and murdered girls and how there was still a serial killer on the streets. Now, one article a few pages back from the one I told you about the mayor told how there'd been several attacks in the area around the same time. Now, one was on New Year's Day 1994. A man dragged a woman from her car after she left Club Bayview. He tried to rape her, but she fought him off. 3 months earlier, a woman got into the back of a taxi and a guy was hiding there and grabbed her, but she was able to jump out and she even broke her leg trying to get out. Then a third incident was in February 1995. A girl just 17 years old was abducted while walking home from Club Bayview. She was grabbed by a man, tied with an electrical cord and driven to Karrakatta Cemetery, not far from the club, and brutally raped. She was left for dead but survived. Then 2 months after Sarah disappeared, a woman was indecently assaulted in a lane behind Club Bayview at around 2 a.m. Her head had been bashed 6 times against a brick wall and she had her skirt ripped off. There was another attack. Now, this happened about 8 years before the Claremont abductions. It was on the 15th of February 1988. A man broke into a house in Huntingdale in the middle of the night. Now, he attacked a young woman in her bed while she was sleeping. He attempted to stuff a knotted stocking into her mouth. She broke free and her father woke up and ran to help. When the attacker fled, he left behind a silk kimono and the knotted stockings. Now, DNA would be recovered eventually from this kimono. So, there are attacks on women in the area going on well before and after the 3 main cases they're investigating. Police are probably looking at a lot of cases. Whether they're looking at some of these other cases straight away or not, we don't know at the time. But they would set up this Telstra Living Witness project. Now, this asks women in the area that may have been picked up by men driving Telstra corporate cars or vans. They asked them to come forward and tell police of their experience getting a lift, because people had seen these white, maybe corporate Telstra vehicles in the area when these girls gone missing. Now, they wanted to set this project up because they thought it was likely the killer would have picked up women and not murdered them. And so they began trying to find these living witnesses who could provide vital clues about the offender. Now, after a while, several women did come forward and they were able to create an identical photo of this guy that had picked them up. Now, this wasn't guaranteed to go anywhere. It was a calculated guess that the serial killer was using a Telstra vehicle just from those eyewitness reports that these vehicles may have been involved. But they were desperate for any leads, any small detail that might lead them to the monster preying on young women. So in my audio podcast, this is where we had a break, but the video one, we're just going to keep going on. So we're up to Lance Williams, the guy that police arrested as a suspect in April of 1998. Well, if you would watch the Ripper series on Netflix, which aired recently, the cops put a lot of effort into looking for a suspect after being sent letters and an audio cassette from this alleged Ripper, only to find out in the end that it was all a hoax. Even though some police thought the letters and the audio cassettes were not genuine, these police were ignored while the investigation went down the wrong path. It was also the case with Lance Williams. Police ran surveillance on him for at least a year, pouring precious resources in, trying to pin the murders on him. Now, this would turn out to be a big mistake, and as the new millennium dawned, they were no closer to catching the Claremont serial killer. With these high-profile cases, now police they just reach out for any information they can get from the public, anything that might get them a lead. Now, this is a bit of a catch-22 thing. The more information you get, the harder it is to manage. Now, there will also be those that genuinely believe it was their next-door neighbour or their ex-husband or co-worker without any real evidence. But police still have to log their calls and then triage it as a potential lead or not. Now, this all takes time, it takes money. By 2004, ABC TV aired a show called Australian Story, which was a weekly show about, well, Australian stories. Now, this particular episode featured the Claremont case, and they had experts that they'd interviewed from around the world and Australia who recommended that independent review of this case was needed using the latest techniques. So this is like 8 years after the events. Now, this pissed off the Western Australian police, who hit back by saying that they had reviewed the case 10 times over the years. Now, that's okay if you're looking at your own data again and again and again. You really sometimes need somebody else from outside to come in and have a look. Nevertheless, this sort of publicity did kick off a new look at all the evidence with fresh eyes to see if they could find some little detail that might give a new lead in the case. With the mountain of evidence collected, the answer was probably there somewhere. They just needed to go over it using the latest technique and procedures. So in November of 2004, an independent case review began with 5 experts from Australia and overseas. 2 detectives from Australia, a profiler from Seattle, and 2 forensic experts from the UK. They initially found that there'd been a thorough and extensive collection of evidence, but now it required an overview of everything, and they could then piece all these parts together. The psychological profiler said that the murders and abductions probably weren't the first time he had offended, and I will say he, as I think it was certainly pretty much assumed it was a bloke doing it. It was suggested that investigators should have a closer look at crimes that had occurred before and after that 14-month span between Sarah Spears going missing and the murder of Ciara Glennon. The forensic reviews, well, they've found that there were a lot of fibres that were similar to those found on the clothing and bodies of both Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon. Fibres that seemed foreign or out of place on them that shouldn't have probably been on both of them. These would need to be sampled and investigated as to their origins. Now, this review of the forensic evidence did provide more clues, but still didn't give investigators a name. Operation Macro was disbanded, but the major crime squad was formed to take over the case. Then in 2008, a further review of forensic evidence found that a lot of the samples had yet to be tested thoroughly. Now, there are tens of thousands of pieces of evidence in this case at this time. Now, why the next piece of evidence I'll tell you about wasn't thoroughly tested is beyond me, but here we go. A fingernail sample from Ciara Glennon had been taken at her autopsy and hadn't been tested for DNA. Now, it revealed 2 DNA profiles. One was Ciara's and the other was an unknown male. So now they had a crucial link in the case, the killer's DNA. Hopes were up that a suspect would soon be found. Now, further investigation found that the DNA matched that of the Karrakatta rape survivor case that I've told you about before. Now, even though they had DNA tested so many people they suspected in Perth, plus all the taxi drivers, the DNA recovered from Ciara and the Karrakatta rape survivor failed to match anyone on record. What police hoped would be a magic bullet in solving the case just went nowhere. Now, 7 years later in 2015, a local newspaper published the details of the DNA connection between the Claremont killings and the 1988 Karrakatta rape. The public were in shock at this news, and it got police again doubling their efforts. They then looked back to a couple of crimes in the 1980s in Huntingdale. Now, one was the one I mentioned before, where a man had entered the bedroom of a girl with a silk kimono and he had held her down while trying to stuff a stocking in her mouth. She was able to break free and call her dad for help, but the perpetrator fled. Now, DNA testing of that kimono matched that which was found in Ciara's fingernail clippings, and further investigation found it matched that, of course, of the Karrakatta rape survivor. As I mentioned in part 1, in February 1995, A girl just 17 years old and referred to as KJG in the trial was grabbed by a man while walking home from Club Bayview. Bit of a trigger warning here, and it goes on for a few minutes. I don't go into heaps of detail, but enough detail that it might upset some people. Now, this is her story. Of course, I've removed some of the fine detail from these court records. I don't think we need to spell out absolutely everything here. You can read it online if you want to go there. When KJG was about 10 metres down from Langsford Street, she was grabbed from behind. She didn't see where the person came from, and she didn't see a car pull up or slow down on Gagary Street. She did not see the person who grabbed her. The man put his left hand over her mouth and his right hand on her bicep. She tried to get his arm off by shrugging her shoulders from side to side and moving her right arm backwards. He pushed her to the ground on the side of the park, away from the road, by pushing her with both of his hands onto the front of her shoulders at the top of her chest. She fell to the ground. The man then bound KJG's wrists behind her back. He put a thick cloth or gauze or sock into her mouth. She struggled by bringing her legs up and pushing forward with her pelvis to try and push him off. He put one arm under her back and one arm under her knees and picked her up and walked her about 10 metres or 20 paces to her vehicle. She didn't know where the vehicle was parked because her eyes were closed. The man put KJG into the vehicle. She didn't recall hearing any doors open. She could feel that there was space around her in the back of the vehicle. There was a bit of room to move, and she wasn't resting against the seat. It felt like she was resting against the side of a vehicle. She was sitting on a tray top with no cushioning. It was metal and she could feel carpet. The vehicle was light coloured. She thought it was a type of panel van because of the way she was put into it. The man put a cloth bag over her head made of cotton or calico. He tied her feet together with a piece of cord. Her feet were in front of her and her knees were bent. She was sitting up in the back of the vehicle and she was very frightened. KJG estimated she was driven around for about 25 minutes. She heard her abductor speak but couldn't hear what he said because it was muffled. She wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or if there was somebody else in the car. The car stopped and the man came around to the back of the vehicle. He opened the back and pulled her down to the back of the vehicle. He lifted her out and carried her with one arm under her legs and the other arm behind her back. At some point, her legs dropped down and he dragged her by holding her under her arms and pulling her along so her heels were dragging in the dirt. Her shoes came off at this time. The man put KJG down on the ground on her back. She could feel sand, grit and twigs underneath her. She still had the bag over her head. Now the man sat on top of her with his legs on either side. He pushed up her top and her bra and rubbed her breasts. He undid the zip at the back of her shorts and pulled her shorts and undies halfway down her legs to about her knees. He undid the cord around her ankles and ripped and pulled the shorts and undies off. The man pushed KJG's legs apart and raped her. The man pulled the bag off KJG's head while he raped her and took the cloth out of her mouth. She kept her eyes shut and pretended to be unconscious. He continued to rape her for 5 or 10 minutes. The man rolled KJG over onto her stomach. She kept her eyes closed. He continued to rape her and she felt a lot of pain. She remembered her face lying against the dirt. After that, the man got up and walked off. KJG knew he'd walked off because she could hear his footsteps on the twigs on the ground. She didn't see where he went to. She stayed just lying where she was. She opened her eyes but didn't move her head. All she could see was a tree and that it was dark. The man was away for about 2 minutes. He came back and picked KJG up like he'd done before, one hand under her back and the other hand under her legs. She had her eyes closed. He walked her about 8 steps or 5 metres and pushed her into some bushes by dropping her down from about half a metre. She heard him walk off. She rolled herself to her knees and tried to stand up and started struggling to get her arms free. KJG heard the man coming back, so she sat down in the bushes. The man pushed her on her right shoulder so that she fell onto her side. He then picked her up again again, one hand under her back, the other hand under her legs, and walked her about 3 or 4 metres. He threw her into the centre of some bushes that were a lot denser than the other bushes. She lay in the bush and acted like she was unconscious. KJG heard the man walk away and then heard the car start and drive away. She didn't see any car lights. Her hands were still bound, but she kicked the cord off from around her feet. She rolled out of the bushes and stood up. Although it was quite dark, she realised that she was in a cemetery because she could see some gravestones. She ran through some bushes and out a gate that was about 5 metres from where she was lying in the bush. KJG turned left and walked down to Dalkeith Road on the opposite side of the road of the cemetery. She said it was getting lighter, so she thought it was near dawn. She had no clothes on the lower part of her body. The first street sign she saw was Corella, and she turned right and kept walking straight. She saw some houses, but didn't seek help there because she was too frightened and was embarrassed because she didn't have any clothes on. She got her vest off and draped it over the front of her with her elbows. KJG walked some distance, then found a Salvation Army building. She walked up to a sliding door and opened it. She walked into the bottom part of the building into a foyer area. She saw a phone on the wall and knocked it off the wall with her chin. She dialed 000 with her chin, but it didn't work. Don't forget, her hands are still bound. She dialed her home number with her chin, and that didn't work. She pushed several red buttons with her chin. She was yelling out, "Help me, help me." She put her ear to the receiver and heard a woman on the other end. She said, "Can you help me? Come and get me." The woman asked where she was, but she didn't know. She told the woman that she'd been raped and started crying. KJG then ran out of the building and down Corella Street. She saw headlights coming towards her, so she ran across the road and hid behind some parked cars. She thought that the person who'd attacked her might have been in the vehicle and that he was looking for her. While she was hiding behind the car, she ripped her hands apart so that her hands were free, although the cord was still wrapped around her left hand. She watched the vehicle drive past. It was a white van like a minibus or a white panel van. KJG, she ran further along the road to a phone box on the corner of William Street and Monash Avenue, Nedlands. She dialed 076 and spoke to the operator. She asked the operator to put her through to her friend's number, but no one answered. The operator asked her what she wanted to do, so she asked the operator to put her through to her parents' number. Her father answered the phone. She was crying and she asked him to pick her up. She could see a sign that said Hollywood Hospital, so she asked her father to come pick her up from there. Now, after she hung up the phone, KJG went to Hollywood Hospital and bashed on the doors and cried out help. She saw a nurse at the end of the corridor pointing to her to go around the side of the building. She became hysterical and pushed all the numbers on the security code pad. Now, the nurse saw this wasn't normal, so she came towards her and opened up the door. She took her inside and got her some yellow hospital pants. Now, not long after that, her parents and the police arrived. Now, KJG stated that throughout the incident, she kept her eyes closed much of the time. The only time she saw her attacker was when he first pushed her to the ground. At that time, she only looked at him for about a second, and she was not directly looking at his face. Now, later the police took KJG to the cemetery near where her clothes had been found by police. Now, nothing of hers was missing except her sister's licence that she had with her. She didn't know exactly when she lost it either. She didn't know what happened to the bag that was on her head or the cloth in her mouth. After she'd spoken to police and showed them where she'd walked, she was taken to the Sexual Assault Resource Centre, or SARC, for a medical examination. What an absolutely horrifying experience. Now, I did go into detail about that, and there will be another case that I will go into detail. Now, from what we now know, she is very lucky to be alive. So now they know that they've got a link to the murder of Kira, a home invasion, and an assault in Huntingdale, plus the Karrakatta rape. The other 1988 case was found where a man in a woman's 90 had attempted to break into a home via a sliding door. He was disturbed while trying to open the door and fled, but there were fingerprints on the sliding door left behind. Now, this case seemed very similar to that kimono case in the same area around the same time. Now, those fingerprints, they were examined, and bingo, they matched those of a guy that had been convicted of assaulting a woman at Hollywood Hospital in 1990. Bradley Robert Edwards. Now, Edwards, he was born in 1968, was a Telstra technician who'd been working on the phone lines at the hospital. In 1990, WD, as she would be known in court records, was working at Hollywood Repatriation Hospital as a senior social worker. She worked in the Allied Health Office, which was located in an annex at the back of the palliative care unit of the hospital. She shared the office with a senior physiotherapist and a senior occupational therapist. The office area was at the end of a ward, and there was a toilet on the other side of the office. On the 7th of May 1990, at about 1:30 or 2 p.m, she was seated at her desk in the office facing the window. She was writing a report and recalled that she wanted to get home for her daughter's birthday. She was alone in the office area. She heard someone at the door to the ward, and Edwards, who was doing work on the phone system, said to her words to the effect of, "Excuse me, can I use the dunny?" or "Where's the toilet?" or "Can I use the toilet?" She couldn't recall the precise words that he used. She glanced around by swivelling on her chair and saw that the person who'd spoken to her was a telecom worker. She said, "Yeah, sure," and carried on writing her report. WD heard the toilet flush and then became aware of Edwards behind her moving towards the ward door. He said, "Oh, I've dropped my pen. Can I go back and get it?" She then felt him put his right hand over her face from the right-hand side. Now, he had a cloth in his hand, and she recalled that it was a light-coloured cloth, which was heavier than a handkerchief. He put the cloth over her mouth. He forced her up with his right hand against her face and with his left arm lifting her shoulders. He pulled her up and back with her, and her chair moved back with her. WD struggled as Edward pulled her up and back. At first, she tried not to breathe in because she thought that there was something on the cloth. Then when she had to breathe, she realised that there wasn't anything on this cloth, so she struggled harder. Her feet slipped on the carpet as she was being pulled back and up towards the door to the toilet, and one of her shoes fell off. As she struggled, she twisted around and kicked Edwards hard in the leg. The chair fell over. Now, the struggle lasted only 10 seconds, and then Edwards stopped. WD staggered backwards but remained on her feet. She looked at Edwards and moved back. He moved towards her and said, "Oh, I'm sorry. She moved as quickly as she could towards the door. She had one shoe off and a cardigan hanging off her. She ran up the ward. She saw a locum doctor and tried to explain to him what had happened, but she could hardly speak because she felt she was in shock. The doctor continued towards Edwards and she went to the nurse's station. WD suffered bruising and contusions on her neck. Edwards would be charged, and on the 1st of June 1990, he was convicted after pleading guilty to the offence of unlawful assault and was sentenced to 2 years probation. Now get this, and this will get your Kebo rage going. He kept his job and was later promoted. I mean, what the fuck, Telstra? I mean, we know you can be pretty hopeless corporation. What are you doing? Anyway, now police, they had a name to the fingerprints from the guy in the 90 trying to break into the house. There was a similar crime to that of a home invasion where the kimono was left behind, and the DNA from that crime matched that from Kira's fingernail clippings and the Karakata rape survivor. Now they had a name. They needed really a sample of Edwards' DNA just to tie everything up. Edwards was followed by undercover cops to a movie theatre. During the movie, he drank from a bottle of Sprite. Now, he left that bottle behind after the movie ended and police collected it, and when tested for DNA, it was a positive match. After 2 decades from when Sarah Spears had gone missing, they now had the perpetrator. Not to mention, it had been nearly 30 years from those first known attacks. Now, at about 7:30 a.m. on the morning of the 22nd of December 2016, police officers attended the house of Edwards in Kewdale. The tactical response group were the first to burst in. Edwards was at his home at the time when was restrained by the officers. Now, shortly thereafter, investigating officers, including Detective Senior Sergeant Maripodi, entered the house and Edwards was formally arrested. He was told why the police were there. He was advised of his rights and provided a copy of a search warrant for the premises. Now, I'm being told the reasons for his arrest, Edwards acted with apparent shock and surprise.
All right, that's for you. I'm going to inform you now that you're under arrest on suspicion of the willful murder of Kira Glennon.
What?
Jane Rimmer.
What the
Sarah
fuck?
Spears.
What?
For the aggravated sexual and abduction of KJG in 1995 in Roe Park.
The fuck? What the fuck's
in Roe
going on?
Park, and for the break and enter and indecent assault in 1988 of AH.
Who?
Later in the conversation, when asked if there is anything that he wished to ask, Edwards said, "I don't know. Why? Why me?" When asked whether there was anything he wanted to say in relation to the allegations, he said, "I'm innocent." When asked if there was any property in his house belonging to Miss Spears, Miss Rimmer or Miss Glennon, he said, "Why would there be anything like that in here?" When told that the police would be executing a search and that he would then be taken to police headquarters, Edwards said, "Why me? Why are you just picking on me? Why are you choosing me?" Edwards was taken from the house at approximately 9 a.m. and arrived at the Cold Case Homicide Squad offices in Pearce Street, and that was about 9:20 a.m. He was placed into an interview room. Now, the interview commenced at 9:53 a.m. and concluded at 11:27 p.m. the same day, with a number of breaks. Now, the interviewing officers were Detective Senior Sergeant Maripodi and Detective Senior Sergeant Capes. Edwards consistently denied the allegations put to him and maintained his innocence. He said that he was not involved in anything like that. He specifically denied any involvement in the alleged murders of Miss Spears, Miss Rimmer and Miss Glennon. In regards to the Karrakatta offences, he said, "I don't know anything about any of this." In regards to the Huntingdale offences, he said that he vaguely knew AH as a girl from school, that's the kimono one, but said that he could hardly remember her. The only thing he could remember about AH was going for a swim at her house when they were in primary school. He denied ever going back to her house on any other occasion. He said he knew nothing of a break-in at AH's house in 1988, adding, "And I think it would be something that I'd remember." He told police about his couple of failed marriages, where he lived over the years, and other things about himself. And I'm not really going to go much into his personal life at all, other than to say that Edwards worked for Telstra from 1988 until his arrest. There really isn't anything in his past that stands out as unusual at all. He was basically the average guy next door. He denied frequenting the Claremont area, having any friends that lived there, or having any reasons to drive through the area at night time. He knew that there were nightclubs in the area, but he said, "I've never been to them." He'd not been to Club Bayview or the Continental Hotel, but had been to the Ocean Bay Hotel in the late 1980s. When asked whether he was aware of the disappearance of the 3 girls from Claremont, Edwards said, "I think everyone's aware of that." However, he denied any involvement in those disappearances and said that he was 120% positive about that. Anyone who ever says more than 100%, they're lying to you. I will tell you that. 100%, that's it. You can't have 120% of something that's only supposed to be 1. 100%. Anyway, let's get back to it. He also denied any knowledge as to who was involved. When asked if there was any reason why his DNA would be associated with any of these offences, Edwards said, No, why? Why would it be? He denied knowing where Eglinton is or ever having been to Piccadilly Road. He said he knew where Wellard is, but denied having been to Woolcott Road. Edwards then provided a sample of his DNA at 11:52 a.m. At 8:16 p.m, the police had obtained the results of this DNA test. When Edwards was told that his DNA was a positive match, he said, How could that be? I don't understand. I didn't do it. I didn't do any of this. When told specifically that there had been a match with DNA obtained from KJG, that was the Karrakatta rape, the following exchange occurred.
Detective Senior Sergeant Maripodi. On the 12th of February 1995, KJG was abducted from Roe Park. She was taken to Karrakatta Cemetery where she was raped. Wasn't me. Your DNA.
I don't understand what you're saying.
Matched to DNA obtained from KJG. Your DNA. No one else's. Yours.
I didn't. I wish I could explain.
Tell me what happened, Bradley. What happened?
I don't know what happened. I wasn't there.
Do you understand what I've just said to you? Your DNA.
Yeah, you keep saying that. But it's not going to change
The
anything.
DNA came from semen. Explain.
How can I explain it? I don't know what you mean by explain it. What do you're assuming I've done it?
Edwards was then told about the results of the test as compared to DNA taken from Keira Glennon, and the following exchange occurred.
Detective Senior Sergeant Maripodi. You sure? Keira Glennon, 27 years of age, taken from Claremont on the 14th of March 1997, murdered and dumped on Piccadilly Road in Eglinton. The male DNA profile from the KJG matter is the same as the DNA profile recovered in this matter here. What happened, Bradley?
I don't know. I wish I could explain it and say I was wherever. I don't know.
Brad, your daughter said that your most prized virtue is your honesty. This is your chance to show that she's right.
I'm being honest.
Did you hear what I just said?
Yes, I heard what you said.
Your daughter has said your prized virtue is your honesty.
I don't know what to say.
Are you a man that accepts responsibility for his actions?
Yes, I am.
Now is the time to accept your responsibility.
I accept responsibility for stuff I've done, not stuff I haven't done.
Edwards was then told about the results of testing in the Huntingdale matter and was shown a photograph of the kimono.
Detective Senior Sergeant Maripodi. Do you know what this is?
No.
It's a kimono, a dressing gown. Yep, you should know what it is.
Why?
Your DNA has been located in a number of locations on that item. Your DNA, no one else's, yours.
Impossible. Never seen it before.
Never seen it before?
No.
Hadn't worn it?
No.
It's her bedroom there. That item was left there. She was attacked in her bedroom, Bradley.
I didn't do it.
Tell me about where this came from.
I don't know what it is or where it's from.
Okay, so now police have Edwards in custody. That's just the start of this. They will now have to be able to prove their suspicions and charges in court. Now, they will take years to get this case together. They didn't want Edwards to get off on some technicality or from sloppy police work. When you go through the court documents, the one you can download if you like, they did an amazing job. It was an amazing amount of collection there. They interviewed his ex-wives, his friends, his family and co-workers. They had to ask them about events that had happened 20 years before to try to establish if Edwards was in the Claremont area at the time and also in the Huntingdale area, and if he was even at work or not. So they needed work records and talk to his old bosses. Then they were able to match fibres found on Keira Glennon and Jane Rimmer to fibres from Telstra work clothes and to a Telstra work vehicle, a Holden Commodore, that Edwards drove at the time while employed by Telstra. Now, of course, they had this DNA evidence as well. Now, Edwards would be charged as follows. On the 15th of February 1988 at Huntingdale, Bradley Robert Edwards broke and entered the dwelling of E.H. with intent to commit an offence therein, and the offence was committed in the night. On the same date and at the same place as in count 1, Bradley Robert Edwards unlawfully deprived A.H. of her personal liberty. On the 12th of February 1995 at Claremont and elsewhere, Bradley Robert Edwards unlawfully detained KJG, that's the Karrakatta one. On the same date as in count 3 at Karrakatta, Bradley Robert Edwards sexually penetrated KJG without her consent by penetrating her with his penis, and that Bradley Robert Edwards did bodily harm to KJG, and that Bradley Robert Edwards did an act which was likely to seriously and substantially degrade or humiliate KJG. On the same date and at the same place as in count 4, Bradley Robert Edwards sexually penetrated KJG without her consent by penetrating her again, and that Bradley Robert Edwards did bodily harm to KJG, and that Bradley Robert Edwards did an act which was likely to seriously and substantially degrade or humiliate KJG. On or about 27th of January 1996 at Claremont and elsewhere, Bradley Robert Edwards willfully murdered Sarah Ellen Spears. On or about the 9th of June 1996 at Claremont and elsewhere, Bradley Robert Edwards willfully murdered Jane Louise Rimmer. On or about 15th of March 1997 at Claremont and elsewhere, Bradley Robert Edwards willfully murdered Kira Elish Glennon. Now, sorry, maybe I shouldn't say it out, the exact charges as they are. I could have made it a little bit easier, but they've got to get everything right when they're doing this, and with each of these charges there's other parts to it, like just the humiliation part with the rape, and when he went in with the kimono, jumped on that girl's back, there's the deprivation of liberty, all this sort of stuff. So that's what he was up against. 8 charges. Now, he would insist for years that he was not guilty of any of the charges, but then, a month before the trial, which began on the 25th of November 2019, he finally pleaded guilty to counts 1 to 5. But he still insisted he was innocent of charges 6, 7 and 8, and they were the charges of murdering Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer and Kira Glennon. Now, the trial lasted for 95 days, between the 25th of November 2019 and the 25th of June 2020. That's 95 sitting days. It would be held by judge alone. There's no way they could find a jury to judge this case. There would be a lot of eyewitnesses to the accounts. There'd be forensic evidence, circumstantial evidence and propensity evidence. You've probably all heard what circumstantial evidence is, but may not have come across this term propensity evidence. Propensity evidence is evidence that tends to show a person's propensity to act in a particular way or to have a particular state of mind, being evidence of acts, omissions, events or circumstances with which a person is alleged to have been involved. Basically, if he did something once, he could do it again. Or if he didn't do something once, he wouldn't do it again. Now, as Sarah Spears' body has never been found, this is going to probably be the hardest charge to prove. It was shown that Edwards had the opportunity to commit these murders as he was living and working in the area at the times. He had no alibi at all for any of these times that the abductions occurred. His DNA and fibres from his clothes were found on Jane Rimmer and Kira Glennon, along with his DNA found on Kira's fingernail clippings. Now, I'll just read out what happened in this kimono home invasion before we finish this off. The assault that I told you about before. This, just like every other attack, is just disturbing and perverted. Now, this witness came up in court and testified. Now, this happened in Huntingdale, near where Edwards lived. What I haven't told you yet is that she knew Edwards because his younger brother was friends with her 2 brothers, and Edwards' mother was her netball coach. She also attended the same primary school as him. She was referred to in the trial as AH. She was 17 years old at the time. AH went to bed at around 10:30 or 11 p.m. She slept with her head at the end of the bed, on her stomach with her hands under a pillow. During the night, AH felt something on top of her. This woke her up. She felt that she couldn't push up and that something was pressing either side of her from her waist below her arms against her body. She felt a hand come over and be held against her mouth. She said, "It's okay, I won't scream," because she thought it was her boyfriend who had come back into the house. She felt another hand come onto the back of her head. One hand was pushing up and one hand was pushing down. AH moved her head from side to side, stopped, moved again, and then stopped again because she was waiting for the person who she thought was her boyfriend to take his hands off her. She said, "What are you doing? And let go of me." She felt the hand come off the back of her head and the weight of the person shift like he was reaching behind. Then the person moved his other hand and she felt that he had some fabric in his left hand. She noted that the right hand was calloused. AH moved her mouth slightly to the side and said, "I love you." She thinks it's her boyfriend still. She then felt the pressure come off her back a little so she could pull her hand out from under the pillow. She raised her hand up in order to stroke his face. As her finger touched his face, she felt stubble and realised that it wasn't her boyfriend's face because she knew that her boyfriend had shaved that day. She dug or jabbed her fingernail into the man's cheek as hard as she could. The man got off her and AH heard a tiny patter. She said he was very light as he landed on the carpet of her room. She put her hands over her head and braced for about 4 seconds because she thought that he was going to hit her. She turned her head slightly to the side to see who was standing there and didn't see anyone, so she pushed up on her elbow and looked back over her right shoulder towards the bedroom door. She saw a man standing in her doorway facing towards her. He was almost as tall as the door frame and was wearing something like a long-sleeved white cotton nightie. AH said that for half a heartbeat, she and the man stared at each other in the dark, and then she turned around and hammered on her wall and screamed for her dad. As she turned back, Edwards, who we know as Edwards now, took off. She heard a bang and a few seconds later her father and then her mother came into the room and turned the lights on. There was some light in her room from the street light at the front of the house, which came through because her curtains didn't close properly. AH found a kimono lying on her bed along the wall, as well as some black knotted stockings and another piece of material. The police arrived and seized the kimono, stockings and that material, and luckily they stored it away nice and safe. When you look at this case, I mean, he actually knew this girl and he still did what he did. I don't know, maybe he had some sort of infatuation with her or something like that, but she was even living with her parents at the time. They were in the house. She wasn't home alone. I mean, what the fuck was he thinking? Anyway, on the 24th of December, 2020, Justice Hall read out his verdict. And here's a small clip.
The verdicts will be as follows. Stand up, please, Mr. Edwards. On count 6, that on or about the 27th of January 1996 at Claremont and elsewhere, you willfully murdered Sarah Ellen Spears. My verdict is that you are not guilty. On count 7, that on or about the 9th of June 1996 at Claremont and elsewhere, you willfully murdered Jane Louise Rimmer. My verdict is that you are guilty. On count 8, that on or about the 15th of March 1997 at Claremont and elsewhere, you willfully murdered Kira Eilish Glennon. My verdict is that you are guilty. You can sit down.
Well, there you go. 2 out of the 3 charges proven, but how the family of Sarah Spears must have felt. Still, her body hasn't been found, and Edwards being found not guilty was always going to be the hardest charge to prove. On the 23rd of December 2020, Edwards was sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 40 years. Justice Hall added that Edwards will probably die in prison. Now, there are people who think he was involved in other disappearances between 1988 and 2000, but we'll probably never know. Now, Lance Williams, who was arrested in 1998 and endured at least a year of surveillance as the main suspect in the killings, was never formally exonerated by police. He lived to see Edwards arrested, but sadly, he died before the trial. Okay, so the thing is, why won't Edwards tell police the location of Sarah Spears' body? Of course, he's saying he didn't do any of them. He was found not guilty, but it's pretty much a given that he did the crime, right? Police are still investigating the case, but it will be difficult to convict Edwards of her murder, even with more evidence, as he's already been acquitted. It's a double jeopardy type of thing. Now, my message to Edwards, if he ever hears his podcast, my podcast or this video, is to do the right thing. Just this small thing that would mean so much to the parents, family and friends of Sarah. Just let them know where she is so they can move on from that part of their lives. It makes no material difference to you to keep this to yourself. No one will think any worse of you if you admit to her murder and tell authorities where she is. You're so despised by all that nothing will change what people think of you. But maybe you will be seen as someone with just the smallest amount of humanity. You're nothing but scum. You'll never see freedom again. Just do the right thing for once in your despicable life. Okay, Islanders, well, what a shocking case. I mean, police didn't know anything for about 20 years who this guy was. And finally, they didn't give up. They just kept going in it, and just with technology, better techniques, going over the evidence again, making sure the evidence is stored correctly as well, they were able to just piece it all together. It all linked together, and finally, he went down. And yeah, he'll probably never get out. So that's the end of the first show for 2021. I hope we all have a great year. If you want to support the island, there are links in the description for Patreon, PayPal and merch. Please feel free to comment, like and subscribe. I'd truly appreciate it if you share the channel. Hit the bell to be notified. Well, that's about it. I've been your host, Cambo. You have been watching True Crime Island. And as I always say, don't forget to delete your browser history. Good night. Boom fuckalunga.